example Jim uses in this new book is an example of working in an office with 1,000 employees, but only 300 parking spots. Right? How are we going to allocate these parking spots? How are we going to decide who gets to park in the office and who has to park somewhere else or get to work some other way? One logical solution is to say, okay, well, instead of letting people park here for free, instead of having people compete to arrive at the office early to grab a spot and so on, we're going to put a fee on the parking spots. You're going to have to pay to park. And with all that money, we're going to collect from folks who are parking. We'll give that back to everyone in equal dividends because, hey, it's not like anyone has a greater right over a parking spot than anyone else. Of course, that allows people to continue to have choice about whether or not they want to drive to work and park or not. Right? It also means that if you continue driving to work by yourself, you're going to end up losing. Right? Because you're going to pay more in parking fees than you'll get in the dividend. The dividend is going to be a little bit less than a third in this example of what you have to pay. Right? If you carpool with 2 other people, you would break even. Because the 3 of you together would roughly get dividends that cancel out the cost of being in the parking lot. And then if you bicycle to work, or if you walk to work, you take bus to work, you get the dividend without paying any parking fee. You come out of it. We're rewarding people for doing exactly what we need to do. In this case, reducing the amount of parking needs at work. We want to do the same thing with cars. We reward people for reducing their emissions in an equitable way. Sorry. So this was recently a sort of fringe position in economics. But this last year, many thousands of economists signed on to a carbon tax and dividend sort of plan. And they wrote that a carbon tax offers the most cost-effective lever to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed that is necessary. By correcting a well-known market failure, a carbon tax will send a powerful price signal that harnesses the invisible hand of the marketplace to steer economic actors towards a low-carbon future. They continue to maximize the fairness and political viability of a rising carbon tax. All the revenue should be returned directly to U.S. citizens through equal lump sum payments. The majority of American families, including the most vulnerable, will benefit financially by receiving more in carbon dividends than they pay in increased energy prices. And finally, a sufficiently robust and gradually rising carbon tax will replace the need for various carbon regulations that are less efficient. Substituting a price signal for cumbersome regulations will promote economic growth and provide the regulatory certainty companies need for long-term investment in clean energy alternatives. Right, so this is a statement that 4 former chairs of the Federal Reserve signed. Right? I got the email from Janet Yellen. It's the first time she's emailed me about anything. 27 Nobel laureates signed it, 15 former presidents of the Council of Economic Advisors, and over 4,000 economists signed this letter. Right? So it now has support among the vast majority of economists in the United States. And so I want to start by giving you sort of what I'm going to call the Econ 101 of carbon pricing. This is a figure that I adopted from my environmental economics course. How many of you took economics at some point? How many of you hated it? Oh, good. You're right. You're right. So we want to think about the demand for carbon emissions. Right? Well, we can think about demand for carbon emissions the same way we think about demand of any other good. This is one of the economic insights. So in this figure, we have on the horizontal axis tons of carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, or CO2 equivalent, where we could fit methane emissions and so on in here too. And on the vertical axis, we have the price that you need to pay to emit a ton of emissions. Right? And there's some downward sloping demand curve like this, and we don't know exactly what it looks like, but I drew it as a straight line because that's what I do for Econ 101. What we really do know is that when you don't have any price on carbon, when you can emit as much as you want at no cost, we emit about 6 billion tons per year. Right? That's very, very certain. I mean, estimate about 6 billion tons. For these purposes, that is good enough. Right?
And that's a global figure, yes?
This is the U.S. figure.
U.S. figure.
I'm thinking about the United States. So, good question. So, how do we think about this demand? What does the demand curve mean for carbon emissions? Right? Well, the way you think about it is some emissions, some of the tons that we emit are more valuable to us than other tons. Right? So, up here in the high part of the demand curve, these are tons that people are willing to pay maybe hundreds of dollars to emit. Whereas down here in this section of the demand curve, those are the tons that people are willing to pay very little to emit. Right? There's some ton here that people are willing to pay $1 to emit. So that might be the ton of carbon that we emit when we keep the thermostat a little bit cooler than we need in the summer, a little bit warmer than we need in the winter. Right? As you move up the demand curve, you're thinking about actions that are going to be increasingly difficult, or tons of carbon that are being increasingly costly for you to give up. And they're just, right, all those tons of carbon are just lined up from those that are cheapest to avoid to those that are most expensive. Imagine the emissions from combustion engine ambulances. Right? Those are emissions that are pretty valuable to us in certain times. They're high up here in the demand curve. One of the last things we're going to do in decarbonizing the economy is decarbonize ambulances. Right? It's not a high priority for us. It's a very small fraction of emissions, and occasionally it's extremely useful to have a combustion engine move someone to a hospital. Right? But the point is, there are other emissions that we generate right now that are actually extremely invaluable to us, that we're not willing to pay even just a few dollars for. Right? And there are actions that we can take to reduce those emissions. And some of those actions are extremely simple, like wearing a sweater. And then you just imagine actions getting more and more sort of difficult. So, for example, with a tax of $15 per ton of CO2, right? You can imagine now, all of a sudden, there's some incentive to reduce emissions. All of these emissions down here, you can barely see, because $15 per ton is not very much money. Right? But $15 per ton, there are some tons that now you're not willing to pay that whole $15. Those are the emissions that you would actually rather just give up, figure out a way to get out of your life, and so on. The cost of doing all those things would be something, so a tax of $15 per ton would reduce emissions by something like 0.1 billion tons or so. And the abatement cost, the cost of all the actions to reduce those emissions would be about $1 billion. This is, again, rough numbers. Importantly, the tax would also raise roughly $90 billion in revenue. And the insight for carbon dividends is a lot of the question isn't just entirely what's the right tax rate, but what do we do with the $90 billion that we raise on the tons of emissions that we continue to emit in carbon pricing policy. Now, $15 per ton isn't a very high tax. So one way to think about this is $100 per ton is equivalent to about $1 per gallon of gasoline. Right? So $15 per ton means we'd be raising the price of gasoline about 15 cents per gallon. Right? You imagine what trips you would no longer take in the car if gasoline prices went up 15 cents a gallon. There would be some, right? There would be some trips that you would no longer take. But it's not going to radically change how much you drive around. Right? It's a relatively small tax we're talking about. So for purposes of illustration, in the next few slides, I want to think about an emission tax of $230 per ton, or $2.30 per gallon of gasoline, which according to William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in climate economics this last year, $230 per ton in the year 2020 would put us on a path, if we had this instituted globally, put us on a path to limit global warming to 2.5 degrees of warming. Right? So I mean, it's still we need high prices to reduce emissions. So that's of course where the CCL plan would be, and it would take a number of years to get there. But the numbers are just going to be more interesting if we think about a higher tax. And frankly, one of the best things about a dividend is it makes high taxes plausibly supportable by a majority of Americans. Right? So a tax of $230 per ton might, in the short run, reduce emissions by roughly a quarter. And again, we don't know exactly what this demand curve looks like, so that's an estimate. Right? And over the long run, the effect will be greater in the short run because there are more changes we can make in the long run than in the short run. Think about just how much you drive around. In the short run, you might have almost no choice about how much to drive. Right? In the long run, you can move closer to your work, or you get a job close to where you live. Right? In the long run, you could become really fit cyclist. In the long run, you can buy more efficient car. Right? In the short run, you don't have those things available. But it's roughly okay to think in the short run at $230 per ton would reduce emissions by roughly a quarter. What does that mean? Well, that means if we paid the equivalent of $2.30 for every gallon of gasoline, all of the abatement costs, all of the actions that we would take to avoid emissions that are no longer worth $230 a ton, that abatement cost is something like $170 billion. Those would be the investments we'd be making in insulating our homes better, in buying more sweaters, in the slight discomfort, being a little bit colder in winter and a little bit warmer in summer, and so on. Of flying less, and etc. Importantly, though, a tax of that magnitude would also raise roughly $1 trillion in revenue. Right? And so the question is not just what's the tax rate, but what do we do with the $1 trillion that we would raise with a carbon tax of this magnitude? That's per year. Right? The logic of carbon dividends is what we're going to do with it is we're going to give it back to people in lump sum payments. Right? So we would price carbon. You might think, like, how are we going to keep track of how much carbon everyone emits? Right? The carbon tax would be imposed on fossil fuel extractors. We say upstream. There are not very many places you actually need to price carbon. You can price coal at the mine mouth. You can price oil right at the well, and so on. And then everything else gets more expensive in proportion to how much carbon is in that good. Right? So extractors and importers then pass those higher costs on to consumers downstream. And so prices are going to adjust. The prices of goods are going to increase in proportion to their carbon intensity. So some goods, which are very carbon intensive, say gasoline, will increase a lot in price. A price of $230 per ton would increase gasoline prices by about 80%, right? Or about $2.30. They would increase electricity prices by about 50%, airfare by 23%, groceries by 9%, something like education by maybe 5%. Right? Because, of course, education requires a little bit of emissions. These lights are probably being fueled right now by burning some coal and so on. But that's not a very large cost of providing education to people. Most of the cost is not the lights and so on. It's mostly paying people like me to talk. Right? The idea is that these price changes are then going to incentivize people to substitute from high carbon goods to lower carbon goods. Right? You're going to tend to think, okay, well, is there a way that I can get around while relying on less gasoline? Right? Is there a way that I can use less electricity, or, more importantly, this is average electricity, or shift from carbon and electricity to renewable electricity? Right? Are there ways that I could fly less? Right? Are there ways, and shift some of your expenditures towards less carbon-intensive goods? Right? The tax revenues would then be returned to people in equal dividends, with a tax of $230 per ton, which I modeled with my co-author, Mark Paul, in this paper, Disrupting the Dirty Economy, which is a People's Policy Project. Right? A tax of $230 per ton, which would raise prices, these prices by this percent, and it would raise some other prices too, of course, would fund a dividend of over $2,200 per person. Right? An annual dividend of $2,200 per person, while still keeping government whole. So that means that a family of 9 or 5 would get $11,000 in a dividend every year from a policy like this. But we'd also pay a lot more for gasoline, electricity, airfare, and so on. Now, why give everyone the same amount of money back, besides the sort of moral principle that we own the atmosphere in common? Well, an important thing, maybe the thing to take away from this talk, is that the rich pollute a lot more than the poor in this country. Right? So this figure is showing you that if you're the poorest decile, the poorest 10% of American households, right, your cost in terms of what you would pay with a tax of $230 per ton would be not quite $1,000 a year. Whereas if you're in the richest decile, the richest 10% of Americans, your cost would be almost $5,000 per year. In fact, the richest decile pollutes roughly 5 times as much as the poorest decile in our analysis. Nevertheless, although the rich are going to pay a lot more than the poor, right, when we price carbon, as a percent of their income, the effect is smaller. So these light blue bars are showing you on the right axis what this cost is as a fraction of these households' income. Actually, these households' consumption. If you're a really poor household, this would raise costs for you by almost 15% of your income, whereas if you're in the richest decile, it would be by less than 10%. And so a carbon tax is a regressive tax. Even though the rich pollute more than the poor, and they'll pay more in carbon taxes, they'll still pay less as a percent of their income. Another way to think about that is that carbon taxes are regressive because as a fraction of their income, right, poor households spend a larger fraction of their income on carbon-intensive goods like gasoline and electricity and so on. They don't buy as much gasoline and electricity. They spend a larger fraction of their incomes on those carbon-intensive goods. Right? So that's the problem with just relying on carbon pricing to solve our problem. That's when you get people in the streets like we saw in France. Right? And in fact, we've seen attempts to price carbon around the world rolled back because they've been unpopular, because they're pinching poor families more than the rich. It doesn't seem like a fair thing to do, especially in an era when inequality is higher than it's been in decades. The trick then is to give everyone the same dividend back. Right? So what this figure is showing you is everyone gets $2,200. Right? That's the top bar for everyone. And then everyone bears some cost from the policy. So if you're in the poorest decile, you get your $2,200, and then you pay roughly $800 in higher costs, right? Which means you come out roughly $1,400 ahead of where you were, right? Then as you get to richer and richer deciles, right, eventually there's no more benefit to the median household. Once you get to the 6th decile, there's a small benefit to the median household. The top 4 deciles here, the mean person in them pays in more than they get back, right? So that if you are in the richest deciles, right, you're going to lose roughly $2,500 with a carbon price of $230 per ton.
Can you just give a quick, what would you break point in terms of the number of income or
I'll show you some other stuff in just a second. But the important thing to remember here is that this is the mean person within every decile, but of course that doesn't mean every household in the bottom 60% of the distribution comes out ahead. They definitely not. Right? But in general, this would make it a progressive policy. Sometimes I'm asked, why not provide a dividend just to poor households? Right? Which, there might be a case to, but there are a lot of poor middle-income households who are going to need a dividend to not get hurt a lot by this policy. It's hard to figure out exactly where you're going to stop paying the dividend. So you don't save that much money by not providing the dividend to the top 10% or the top 20%. You save 10 or 20% of money. Right? So that doesn't change the analysis much. It's important to understand that giving everyone the same dividend back actually makes this, in general, a progressive policy, where in general, poor people come out ahead and rich people pay out. Right? Of course, the gains here have to equal the losses. For every dollar that's paid and not given back to that household, right, it must be that some other household gets it, and vice versa. So for every dollar that some household comes out ahead, some other household is going to have to come out behind. Which means these green bars add up to the same area as those red bars.
But it's not the same number of households.
It's not the same number of households. Because as you see, the cost, the net cost per person, right, for say the mean household in the 10th decile, right, is $2,500, whereas it's not possible to get $2,500 better off per person because the dividend is only $2,200, and you do, in general, emit something, so you're going to pay something in higher prices as well. Good point. Yes. So this is all a little bit more complicated. If you want some more details, I've got a paper, and you're glad to look at it. It's called the impact of carbon tax and inequality. It would break down some of it. It's actually all calculated in terms of percent, although for a tax of $50 per ton, it's $230.
I just would like to have you repeat the question in case we.
Yeah. So
so you tell us what you are answering.
Did you hear this last question? She asked.
Yeah, I did.
She asked, as a percent of their income, how much better or worse off are households at different spots in the distribution. And I said, I don't have that data with me here, but if you look at this paper, you can see what it is for the mean household in each of these deciles. Sir?
So, this is the rates calculated with no change immediately to what people are doing. That is the impact if they continue to do what they're doing.
Yeah, very astute. So that is actually the way, that's not quite true, but I'm assuming in these numbers I just showed you, right, we're assuming, we are assuming a reduction in emissions here and so on, but we're assuming that everyone reduces emissions by the same amount, as I said, by the same percent.
So I brought this up with somebody at work and said, hey, why aren't you on board with this carbon tax?
Yeah.
He was a contrarian, and he raised the issue that if a person is poorer, they have fewer resources at their disposal to decrease their use of energy that they already use. So a person who is using a beat-up car that gets poor mileage might not be able to get into a high-quality electric vehicle, and a person who's rich can easily
that's an important point, and I think it's like extremely overblown. So I mean, so rich people pollute a lot more than poor people, and it's true that they have more money to invest in certain things and so on, but there's not really any evidence that demand curves have different elasticity, if that makes sense, different responsiveness to price across decile. And if you make some assumptions about differences in elasticity across decile, which I actually do in this paper, it's hard to get a very different result, because it's still the fact that if you're in the richest decile, you pollute not a little bit more, but 5 times as much as someone in the poorest decile. So even if they reduce their emissions, imagine by half, and the poor don't do it at all, there's not going to be a huge impact there.
Right,
But,
I think the problem here is that I live in an older bubble, and my neighbors spent tens of thousands to put in a geothermal heating system in her house, and she produces far more than she uses with her photovoltaic panels, and she has a massive panel of batteries in the basement that do that efficiently well, and on and on. So,
okay, yeah, I think in general that's a concern. I mean, I hope it makes sense, or is sort of what we're thinking about here, but the elasticity of demand doesn't seem like it's all that different by income decile, although it is certainly, there are going to be some people who respond better than others, and of course we're going to reward people who respond more than others. Yes?
So I'm just kind of, I'm thinking a bit devil's advocate of perhaps a conservative talking point that, okay, how about the people who are going to be in hospitals, nursing homes, homeless people? We're giving all those people money that I could argue are not in any way going to be spent towards reducing their carbon footprint if they are incapacitated.
So the really important thing to understand is the dividend, we're not giving people dividends to reduce their emissions. We're just trying to get rid of the money that we raise. We're raising prices proportionally to the carbon intensity of those goods in order to reduce consumption of those goods. And someone in a nursing, I mean, incapacitated people, children, and so on, I guess are not really responsible for their emissions anyway, right? But it does still change prices in the way that nursing homes will think about how to economize on their fossil fuel energy, and kids' parents will think about how many times to drive their kid to some after-school activity and things like that. I feel like maybe I should move through and finish the presentation, and then we'll open up to other questions. I'm glad to see that there are many. So the truth is, of course, more complicated. Not everyone is average. So there are some poor people who have really high emissions, and some rich people who have low emissions, and so on. So when we look at the mean by decile, we're covering that up. Nevertheless, as we report in this paper, under very conservative assumptions, right, 56% of Americans would be better off under the policy. Right, so 56% of Americans would see their welfare sort of go up under a carbon dividend. 84% of folks in the lower class, by which I mean the lower half of the income distribution, would be better off. Right, so the vast majority of poor people win under a carbon dividend. 81% of Hispanic people and 73% of black people come out ahead in a carbon dividend, right? And that's largely a function of the fact that they have lower incomes, right? So it does also help reduce some of these group-based inequalities. 70% of people ages 20 to 40 come out ahead. Again, mostly reflecting the fact that those people don't make as much money. 55% of people in urban areas come out ahead, and surprisingly, for us, we found 56% of people in rural areas come out ahead. You might think that's unintuitive. The reason for it is because although consumption is more carbon intensive in rural areas, you need to drive around more, you're heating up standalone homes and so on, incomes are also a lot lower, right? So on average, the dividend is going to mean more in rural areas than in urban areas, right? So the evidence is really that carbon dividends are going to reduce emissions and reduce many forms of inequality. If you haven't done so yet, I'd encourage you to use CCL's carbon dividend calculator to provide some information about your household, your income, how many people you live with, and so on. And with a bit more information, they'll tell you what's going to happen to your household. Right? Under CCL's policy proposal, my after-tax household dividend would be $71. So this is obviously the carbon price, I believe, of $15 per ton, not anywhere close to $230. My monthly cost due to the carbon fee would be $61. Right? So my net benefit for my household per month would be $10. Right? As you increase the carbon price, you're essentially just going to magnify this difference. Right?
Your percentages that you gave, is that based on $15 of the
It's actually reduced $50 per ton, but it doesn't change all that much. I want to quickly turn to the idea of a Green New Deal, which has gotten a lot of attention recently, and I think that we in the climate and the carbon pricing sort of community should take seriously. So there's of course a congressional resolution, but there's also a serious movement, I would say, behind the call for a Green New Deal. And if you look at polling on the issue, the Green New Deal right now has more support among Americans than either rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, 53% of Americans support that, or taxing emissions, 51% of people do that. NPR America did not ask about the carbon dividend, although I suspect that most Americans would not even know what that means yet, but we're working on that. 63% of Americans, though, support a Green New Deal to address climate change by investing government money in green jobs and energy-efficient infrastructure. Right? And so I think ignoring the political movement here would be, well, it wouldn't be smart for us to do. I think it's important for us to recognize that a lot of the policies that are being pushed in the Green New Deal are complementary. They're not substitutes for pricing carbon or carbon dividend. They complement those policies, right? So my co-authors and I, in a recent paper from the Roosevelt Institute, propose a Green New Deal built on 3 pillars. The first of those is carbon dividends, which I think is crucial to any sort of Green New Deal. It's really hard to imagine in a market economy reducing emissions in an efficient way if people continue to not pay, if we continue to allow people to externalize the cost of emissions. Because there's so many decisions we make in everyday life where essentially we are looking at prices and making a decision based on those prices, without raising the cost of gasoline, without raising the cost of flying, and so on. We're just not harnessing some of the levers we have to reduce those harmful activities. That said, we make a case.
Carbon dividends would be tax the fee and.
Sorry, yeah, thank you. The regulations, there's also a strong case, even with pricing, to adopt some sorts of regulations that are being proposed by components of the Green New Deal. Often, it makes sense for us to do things collectively rather than individually. The genius of carbon pricing is that some decisions are best made by individuals. The government might not have a very good idea whether or not I need to insulate my house. But I actually will have a pretty good idea, because I've been into my attic. I actually know I need to do it. Right? Except at current prices for natural gas, it doesn't actually make sense. I'm not going to save any money doing it. If we raise the price of natural gas, then it would be at my incentive to do it. There are other things, or other decisions that we don't make individually, that we are making collectively, and are often much cheaper to do collectively than individually. One of the recent laws adopted in California is that new homes have to have solar panels put on. Well, of course, if we price carbon, right, there will be more of an incentive for us to put solar panels on our homes. But it's also much cheaper for a developer to put solar panels on every home in a new development, right? Per house, it's much cheaper to put them on every home in a development than find out whether or not some individual thinks it makes sense for them. Right? And finally, public investments are going to be crucial. Right? A carbon price by itself does not provide governments with the funding they need to provide us with, say, carbon-free mass transportation. Right? Governments are going to need money to make those sorts of investments. And so there's no way around public investment to solve some of these coordination problems. I think we can't rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions with both increasing the cost of carbon emissions, which is what we're all working for, and also ensuring that all people have a just transition. Right? There's no way politically that we're going to do this by throwing some small percent of people, but a percent of people under the bus because they happen to choose the wrong industry to work in, right, maybe decades ago. Right? So folks who work in a fossil fuel sector are not responsible for our problem. If we don't ensure them that they're going to have a just transition, that we're going to protect their incomes and livelihoods, get them new fields of work and so on, then we're not going to pass this sort of work. In general, I think it makes sense to use carbon pricing, right, the revenues from a carbon tax, to pay carbon dividends. After all, it's a regressive tax. I think that the other sort of public investments we need ideally should be funded by progressive taxation and, in current macroeconomic conditions, also deficit spending. Right? But of course, that can be debated. I think there's a strong case for not funding too many of those investments with a regressive carbon tax. Right? Ultimately, I guess I'll finish where I started. Our climate crisis and inequality crisis are linked. And the fact that the Green New Deal has been sort of sort of popular. There's momentum gains where I think should cause us to think about, well, what sort of inequities is the carbon dividend community sort of sidelining, and what can we do to try to harness that sort of popularity? How is it we can ensure most people that they can be better off as we decarbonize the economy rather than worse off? And I think, in a way, right, the fact that things are so unequal today, the inequality levels are so high, on the one hand, of course, it makes political change difficult, because we need millions of people who are not going to come out ahead individually all that much. Right? We need millions of people to come together and defeat some vested interests that are going to lose out there. Right? That's the challenge. On the other hand, the fact that society is so unequal right now means there are actually lots of policies that can both make most people better off a little bit each, right, and help us address our climate crisis. So I'll end with, and thank you for fighting the good fight. I think that carbon pricing and carbon dividends are extremely important for meeting our climate challenge, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have about any of this. Sir.
Yeah, I agree with talking about it, and our congressman has moved from really not knowing anything about climate change to recognizing that something needs to be done. He supports the pricing. He is stuck on the dividends that he sees as income redistribution, and we have not been able to tell him or provide any information. Well, we provided lots of information, but none of it has been effective in changing his position on that. Do you have anything to...
What does he want to do with the money?
He doesn't know. But I think he would be up for, well, I think research and development in clean energy is one thing. I think infrastructure he'd probably get behind, and possibly, reducing other taxes.
So the paper I referenced that I wrote with my friend Mark Paul looks at, for example, the distributional impact of reducing income tax or payroll tax instead. And that's a much more regressive policy, right? Because of course you're reducing a tax that's a progressive tax. You're imposing a new regressive tax and you're reducing a progressive tax. So it's bad. So in general, I think that the dividend is the way to go. I mean, in general, I think also talking to politicians, the challenge is not going to be like, what are we going to do with $1 trillion? Right? They're going to have ideas of what to do with $1 trillion. The question is, well, can we give it mostly back to people? And of course, we do need research and development is a great example of something that even if we price carbon at the right rate, we're not going to get private corporations to invest optimally in research and development. Those are public goods that should largely be funded by the public sector. And I'm open to the idea of some carbon revenues going to pay for that, although in general, I would prefer to fund that for progressive taxation the way we should pay for all public goods. I'll let you start.
My question goes back to lower income people. One of the phenomena I'm seeing, I'm from Salt Lake City, we're seeing, because the housing is so high in the center of the city, the richer people tend to live near the core of the city. The lower incomes are living like 35 miles away, having to commute. And so their gas is going up.
Mm-hmm.
So I can see kind of a problem for those guys.
I mean, absolutely, that's a problem. The numbers I present do sort of account for that to the extent that folks, so the data this comes from is a consumer expenditure survey, which surveys a bunch of Americans on what they spend all their money on. And so it sort of knows already that the poor people tend to have longer commutes, they spend a higher percent of their income on gasoline and so on, and despite that fact, the numbers I show you hold true. But I agree they're not going to be excited to see gas prices go up. I think that the case for a dividend is imagine seeing gas prices go up, which they need to go up if we're going to solve this crisis. Right? Imagine seeing it go up without getting any sort of compensation for it. That's the case for the dividend. That yes, your gasoline prices are going to go up, but you're also going to get more money back than you pay in. And I think a really low price of $15 per ton, 15 cents per gallon, people might not really notice. But once once the tax gets to where it's going to have to be to decarbonize the economy, right, we're talking about massive redistribution, where those prices I think are untenable without somehow assuring people that there's going to be a way that we can protect them.
Follow-up to that would be also, if we could somehow make, there's a big discussion in Salt Lake about how to make housing affordable for these people. I mean, that to me would be part of a solution that would reduce the gas. I don't have an answer for that, but making it so they can afford to live in somewhere in the city, so not have to drive so far.
So one of the things is, to understand like the magic of carbon pricing, right? This is sort of an economic sort of philosophy in which actions are made in such a decentralized way that getting the price right is essential for folks in a decentralized manner to figure out all the ways you can reduce emissions. But you can even think about like how does it change incentives in city government under a carbon price? Well, all of a sudden, you know your constituents are paying more for gas, right? It starts to change incentives about, well, should you now invest in mass transit? Right? Should you provide people different ways of getting in the city? Should you adopt different zoning laws that are going to make it easier for more dense housing downtown where people want to be, and so on? And so all of these things need to change. A carbon price can help us change those things. So I think that's all complementary.
Thanks for your talk. I have a sincere question and a serious question. The sincere part is, as a professor, you notice probably with your students, and in my case is the same, I automatically want to jump to the topic about this bill that I know the least about, and that's economics, which is why I'm here, so thank you. Also, given that, I have a better foundation for it now, but there's some open-ended pieces as far as our conversation here about with the rich and the losses to the rich. Does your study, or do you have other facts that could help us communicate the adjustability of the act? It's my understanding that as we achieve goals and targets, the scale of the pricing slides down. Is that something that would resonate when we're having conversations with our affluent stakeholders that we're trying to convince maybe they should support or consider
Our
this?
affluent stakeholders are mostly going to lose out. And I think what we need to ask them is whether or not they care about their grandchildren and the rest of our grandchildren enough to pay the price to do it. And I don't think there's any other way around that. There are lots of ways they can work to reduce their emissions, and what we're going to try to do is we're going to make sure that they pay the full cost of what they're passing on to subsequent generations. So kind of no. But if there's anyone that can afford a tax increase, right, over the last 30, 40 years, it's folks in the top few deciles in this country. And I include myself here. So I'll let the mic pass out or to decide who's going to.
All right, so I have a quick question about the numbers you showed earlier. Because you showed that a $15 per ton tax would reduce emissions by something like 1 or 2%. But on the EICDA's website and also CCL, I've sort of been told that if the tax starts at 15 per ton and then increases to 10 per ton per year, which would take about 20 years to get to 230 per ton, that emissions would reduce by like 50% by 2030. Somehow that seems not consistent with what you're showing.
Well, this demand curve is a little bit hypothetical. So first, just take that as, we don't know exactly what the demand curve is like because we're not pricing carbon yet. But I think the CCL has targets, right, that they want to achieve, and so the tax can rise at a faster than $10 per year rate if we don't meet those targets, and I think that is ultimately why they come to that conclusion. They think the tax is not going to take that long to get $230 per ton, assuming that we do include in the bill a requirement that we meet these ambitious targets. And again, we don't know exactly how high the price is going to have to be to meet those targets, but I think that provides you with a rough idea, right? What I want you to understand is $15 per ton isn't anywhere, we will barely notice $15 per ton, which doesn't mean we shouldn't push for it. That might be the best thing that we can get, right? But getting not just the dividend, but also getting the price essentially as high as we can get it, right, that's the same fight. And the crucial thing to understand, I think, is that the higher the price is, the more the dividend matters to get people to accept the policy. Right? 15 cents per gallon, not a huge deal. But once you start charging people $2.30 extra for a gallon of gasoline, people are going to hurt. And we need to be able to promise them that we're going to be able to transition in a fair way.
Why don't you go ahead?
You want me to point?
Yeah.
Okay, why don't you give it to the guy there right next to you? Sure.
Assumptions are so important in economics. And what's the assumption that you make in this paper, in this presentation too, that wakes you up at 4 in the morning thinking, gosh. And then there were 3 or 4 things that you said in that ecological economics paper in the conclusion that you want to follow up on. Which of those is most important?
You read my paper? I think what my ecological paper and the other word doesn't do as well as it should. And I think actually Kevin Umo, who's put together the CCL's carbon tax calculator, has done a little bit better, is that the geographical distribution, those inequities are not highlighted by that paper, and right now, I'm assuming, for example, that electricity has the same carbon intensity everywhere. And so that's not going to have a huge impact on what I say about deciles, or even I think about rural urban. But it is going to have, it's going to mean that some parts of the country are going to bear higher costs than others. And that's something that I think, honestly, we need to study more. So I think that is the thing that I'm most worried about, and what I would most like to see incorporated in these sorts of models, is a better idea of what is this going to look like across counties and states. I think I'll leave it there. This man's been very patient.
Yes, a CCL commissioned a study called REMI to study carbon gain dividend, and that's been out there for some time. As an economist, how do you look at that? How thorough is it? How representative does it have the answers we need to fully support the carbon gain dividend?
So I'm a microeconomist, and that study is more of a macroeconomic study. I think in some ways what I'd say is like this sort of stuff about just the distributional impact and so on, I think we know with greater certainty than we know the sort of things that come out of any macroeconomic study. Because the constraints on macroeconomic activity and so on, well, they change all the time, year to year, place to place, and so on, and I think it makes it more difficult. So, for example, you can make the case that a carbon dividend, or carbon price, by shifting investments from the fossil fuel sector to renewable energy, is going to have some extra benefit just because the labor share is higher. The fraction of investment that goes to workers is higher in renewable energy than fossil fuel energy, that there's some nice action to get there. And I think that's true, but I think it's also, the main case for a carbon dividend isn't that we're going to get some macroeconomic boon out of it, I would say. The main case is the basic distributional stuff I presented, and just allocating emissions effectively, right? So that's what the pricing does. It gets us to, we always are just going to be thinking like, okay, is it cheaper for me to reduce this ton of carbon than it is for me to pay whatever tax I have to pay? And so I guess I'm less certain about the macroeconomic side. And I think in general economists would agree that they are less certain about that. If you read through the 5 points in the Economist statement on carbon dividends, for example, there is nothing about how we're going to, well, they have that little line there about growth, but what they're thinking about there is just like constant price makes it easier for firms to know what to invest. But they're not thinking about differences in labor share across industries and so on.
So when you use the talking point that we can build the economy through carbon gain dividend, is that overreach?
I think it's maybe a bit of an overreach. I think that some aspects of the Green New Deal are more clearly aligned with that goal, right? For example, deficit spending in a time of like macroeconomic weakness, deficit spending could arguably increase aggregate demand and bring people in the labor force who haven't been in the labor force for a decade now, right? And there'd be some benefits, but dividend itself, there might be some impact, right? Because you're redistributing from people who save money to people who don't save as much money, right? From rich to poor on average. So there could be some little benefit, extra spending there, but it's going to be really minor compared to the other effects. This one here.
Do you know if there's been, so I was thinking about how obviously if it becomes expensive, carbon becomes expensive fuel, the demand for alternatives is going to become higher. Has anyone looked into what the cost of alternatives might be in the future? Like, will it be more expensive for renewables or like for, insulation and things like that potentially? Or has it seen the market will expand or something like that?
Well, so theoretically, the demand curve for carbon that I showed you sort of has that in it. Because all you sort of have each one of those tons, like how much does it cost you to not pollute that ton? And some of the tons, the way you don't pollute them is by hooking your house up to solar instead of coal and so on. And some of them are like buying a sweater, and some of them are like the psychic discomfort of being a little bit colder in winter or whatever. So that's already sort of there. If you think about things like insulation, there's no reason insulation costs should go up even if demand goes out, because it doesn't get more expensive to produce insulation as you produce more of it. Right? This is constant economies of scale. There's probably a good argument to be made that in case of, well, there is a very good argument made in case of solar and wind and so on, that those things will actually get cheaper the more we adopt those things. Batteries for cars, all sorts of stuff. So is theoretically sort of already embedded in.
Thank you.
Maybe this woman here, and then the one behind her.
Yeah, my question is, I remember that graph you had, the sort of circles, you know, how much goes for transportation, how much goes for, you know, well, let me see.
Oh,
It might even be before that. I'm just curious, you know, when you figure those, are you figuring for individuals in their own households? Are you also including what the industrial costs are for bringing you frozen food, their transportation? I mean, what does transportation really include?
Well, so transportation isn't here. So these are all these goods.
Yeah, that's the graph I was
This
looking
is the European map. So the cost of gasoline. Why does the cost go up? Well, that's kind of straightforward. But why does the cost of education go up at all? I mean, this is an input-output model, so we're looking at, well, the educational industry, how much do they buy from, for example, the electricity sector?
You know, how about building the schools in the first place, and also the airfare, is that an individual's expenditure, or is that what it costs to transport?
This is the percent increase in prices. So airfare would go, with a tax of $230 per ton, it would cost about 23% more to get a ticket on an airline. How do we calculate that? Well, we look at what, on average, what industries does the airline industry buy things from? And, well, they get a lot of jet fuel. That's where almost all their carbon comes from, although they also, I suppose, get some electricity and some other things as well. And so all of that is sort of, theoretically, this model takes that all into account. The nice thing about it is we don't need to track, and we're not going to tax you when you get to the airport or something. The price is just going to go up because the cost has gone up now for buying jet fuel for the company. So it'll go up sort of automatically.
Essentially, that is personal airfare. But now groceries, for example, getting the groceries to the store, and you know, what was involved in making them. You know, I mean, just
so they'll go about 10%.
So
they would go about 10% in cost, including that transportation and retail and everything.
Okay.
So, food is just not very. Why don't you pass it to the woman in the blue scarf? Food is not going to get much more expensive because food is not particularly carbon intensive. So one thing to think about rural communities, the price of food is going to go up as well. So the impact on farmers, for example, is going to be fairly negligible because a lot of what they're going to see is price of food is going to go up roughly 10%, or maybe a little bit less than that before it's transported to stores and so on. But they roughly get compensated. So in these models, I mean, the other big assumption in these models, which actually means in many ways that the outcome is even rosier than what I'm presenting, is that we're assuming that all the price increases are passed forward to consumers. That consumers bear 100% of the carbon tax burden. In fact, they probably don't bear, well, they don't bear quite 100%, which is why fossil fuel companies are not excited about our policy, right? But consumers do bear the vast majority of it, probably, you know, on the roughly 80, 90% or something.
So given that, my question is a little bit related. How effective would this be, or what is the projected impact if we're trying to do this on a state-by-state level, sort of in the interim of a federal policy, given that the tax would be upon the upstream point of extraction, but the consumer could be across borders in a different state that's bearing the cost of that and not receiving a dividend?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So it's a little bit more difficult to adopt this sort of tax at the state level because we have implicitly, I didn't note it, but border adjustment tax to make sure that imports, for example, with a lot of carbon get taxed appropriately, so U.S. producers are not penalized by the fact that we're addressing our climate crisis and so on. Doing that in every state is much more challenging. Probably the only border adjustments we make would be for fuels or something. So it's not ideal, but essentially it means we're just not going to be covering as much of the emissions. We're not going to be covering the emissions of imported goods, for example, right? And we might need to figure out how to provide state-based producers with some sort of rebate to keep their exports competitive and so on. So it is more challenging. It's definitely not impossible. Of course, states are much more strapped for money too. So whenever I've been asked to think about state policies, and they always have things they want to do with the money because they don't have money in the way the federal government does.
We have time for one more question.
One more question. Why don't you give it to this guy in the blue shirt?
Sure.
Or are you raising your hand? Or are you just give it to this woman in purple man? All right. 2 questions. I'll go real fast.
All right, it's burning a hole in my pocket to get the overlap between real sociology and microeconomics. it really doesn't matter whether you're at the top of that scale or at the bottom of that scale. What happens to these people when they get $2,000 in a lump sum? What happens to them when they get their income tax return back? What's the first thing they spend on?
You tell me.
Drugs. First thing they spend on is alcohol to celebrate the fact that they got, instead of it going into the tank as renewable fuel, it goes in their mouth.
Well, drinking $2,200 of alcohol is going to be a challenge. But,
Well,
look, there are lots of, you could say this about every payday, and of course people spend
I'm saying about this payday.
To me, there are ways we can spread out the dividend. We don't give them a single rebate. We give them a monthly rebate. I don't see it any different necessarily from being paid on Friday or whatever.
Thank you for one last question. I think we all recognize the importance of addressing inequality, and we know there's study after study that shows that the most vulnerable are impacted more by climate change. So I think trying to make these policies more progressive is in the interest that we all are trying to achieve. There are now 4 or 5 other dividend acts out there, and some of them have different ways of using the dividend, including trying to support infrastructure, housing for low-income people, not having tax on the dividend. I mean, there's a number of options. I'm wondering if you've looked at any of those other uses for the dividend, and if you have been able to analyze that the elasticity curve does change when you have some of these other measures.
Well, I don't understand how the difference in policy would affect the elasticity really, but I understand, of course, there's going to be competition about what we do with these revenues. In general, my perspective is that if we want to fund public goods like research and development, mass transit, we should fund those with aggressive taxation or deficit spending, and that we should try to reserve our carbon price, our carbon revenues, for equal dividends to everyone. There are a few different ways you can think about how you keep government whole. So one is, notice I said we were going to raise $1 trillion, but then I said every person is getting $2,200. You might have thought, well, you just lost like couple $100 billion, Professor. This analysis was keeping government whole that I presented, and so you can sort of keep it whole by give people a larger dividend to have it be taxable, which would roughly keep government whole. Or in our analysis, we just assumed that government got their own rebate that I did not show you, but so that local, state, and federal governments were not cash strapped. They were neither winning or gaining in the policy. Good question. Thank you so much.